Well, continuing with personal identity. So we ended with Locke in his psychological continuity account, personal identity, which says, well, what makes you the same person over time has nothing to do with your body, right? You could lose the body, have your mind somehow uploaded, translated, right, transferred into another body, as long as your psychology, in some sense of whatever that means, psychology, consciousness, stays the same, right? That is the essence of you, and that's what makes you the same person over time. Um, Derek Parfit here. So Locke is, back sort of after Descartes, 1700s. Now we're up to 20th century, um, and Derek Parfit is going to expand on some of these intuitions, right? Push them to their limits, and come to some conclusions that there are certain limitations to the psychological continuity account. And he's going to propose a slightly different account called psychological connectedness. So um, we've already done a few sort of wacky thought experiments, right? Where you imagine, oh, what if I lost my leg? Well, what if I lost my whole body except my head? Oh, what if I did a Freaky Friday thing and totally switched bodies with somebody, the prince and the cobbler, right? Switch bodies. Um, and we've said, what we're doing with these is we're testing our concepts. So Parfit is really going to push this into sort of overdrive, right? We're going to be doing thought experiments about split brains, um, bodies sort of dividing and then fusing again, immortal bodies, right? So it can be easy to lose track of sort of what the point of all of this is. Um, and again, the point is to sort of test our intuitions about what we as humans, as English speakers, mean by personal identity. Right? We all more or less share a similar concept of this thing, and we're trying to hone in on what that concept is. Now, I see here we have, right, Schrodinger's cat. So it's not just philosophers that do thought experiments, right? No one has ever done this experiment with the cat. Um, but nonetheless, it's a useful thought experiment in physics. If you ever read any Einstein, he uses thought experiments a great deal as well. So just because we're sort of using our minds to figure this stuff out and not doing actual experiments, it doesn't mean it's necessarily any better or worse, right? It's just another way of investigating a certain thing. So some of the concepts, right, that we are sort of like trying to figure out, find the boundaries of, maybe hopefully find necessary and sufficient conditions for, or at least, get closer to those, are notions of identity, which we've already explored a bit with Locke, right, and Descartes. Uh, Parfit is going to argue that the notion of survival is an important one, right, that should be in the mix here. Psychological continuity, we've seen, is Locke's account. A different concept, psychological connectedness, which we'll introduce a bit later. Um, and the thing Parfit's going to point out is that often all of these concepts sort of come glued together in a package. In a normal human life, um, you're identical to yourself, and when you survive from week to week, your psychology, right, is continuous from week to week, and it is also connected, right? Now, you don't yet know the difference between continuity and connectedness. We'll get into that, right? But we don't normally have any reasons to sort of pull these concepts apart. They sort of all go together in normal circumstances. And you may start to think that all these different concepts are more or less synonymous, right? And Parfit wants to say that they're not, right? So, um, again, we can't use a particle accelerator to sort of smash our concepts together and sort of see what flies off. Um, but we do use thought experiments to sort of pry them apart, right? We paint a scenario and see if survival and identity or psychological continuity, if the differences between those concepts become clearer, right, in that when we describe certain situations. And again, we don't need to worry about the fact that some of this may be physically impossible, right? Um, the notion of possibility here that we're concerned with is primarily logical possibility because that's the relevant um, concept to, again, investigating concepts, right? Our concept of personal identity. So Don't worry too much if it seems like unscientific or not possible technology. Um, but do stay on the lookout for logical contradictions, right? If it seems logically impossible, then that's a potential paper topic, right? If you see some contradiction lurking in there that's not explicit in Parfit, that's a great paper that you can write. Okay, so Parfit's goal here is to again pry apart all these different concepts that are involved in the concept of personal identity or that often come along with it, and sort of see what falls out. See if one of these concepts that we've sort of had fused together, because in everyday life they all seem to follow each other, see if one of them is actually the most important one. Um, and maybe also see if identity even has these sort of necessary and sufficient conditions where there has to be a yes or no answer to whether you are or are not the same person as before. It might turn out that there's fuzzy boundaries there, right? And personal identity could turn out to be a matter of degree. So let's start walking through these various thought experiments. So this first one is division. So suppose I cut your brain in half and put it in two different bodies, right? Suppose that the bodies are cloned, right? So they're identical. Um, but each one has a half of your brain. One has the left half, one has the right half. Um, we can ask the question, which one is you, right? Um, and it seems there's three possible answers. Maybe neither one is me. Maybe one of them is me, but not the other, right? Or maybe both of them are me. Um, Now, this might seem a little far-fetched, but it's not so crazy. We know that people can live with half a brain, right? This happens. Um, so the neither answer seems like it must be false, right? It can't be that I just die, right? Because if you had just taken half of my brain and thrown it away, I would live. People can live, right? When that happens. Um, so the answer has to be either one or both, right? If the answer is that one of us is me, well, how do I pick which one, right? That's a tricky question. I just say, oh, it's the left half? It's sort of arbitrary. Why not the right half? Um, and if the answer is both of us are me, that seems like logically impossible, right? This was sort of one of Locke's assumptions. If two things are in different places at the same time, they are not identical, right? So if I'm in a single person can't be in two bodies, you might think. So none of these are great answers, right? Already we've come upon a puzzle pretty quickly. Um, Parfit wants to think more about the idea that maybe both are you, right? Our instinct is that's crazy or sort of logically impossible, um, but maybe not. Imagine another scenario, right? Suppose that instead of taking one half of your brain out and putting it in another body, suppose that you are able to, maybe with some sort of implant, um, divide and reconnect the two hemispheres of your brain at will, right? So sometimes some people, when they have extreme like epilepsy, they will cut the connection between the two hemispheres, right? So and people can live that way. So he's imagining, suppose that's happened, but then you have sort of radio transmitters, right, put in that can reconnect the hemispheres, but then you can just switch them off if you want. So I can switch between two hemispheres connected or two hemispheres separated, right? Sort of like the two body scenario, but in the same body, and I can switch back and forth, right? So suppose this is you, right? You've got a brain that you can split when you want to and not. Why would you ever want to split it? Well, maybe you're taking a midterm, right? And you're sort of on the clock and you've got to write two essays. And so you just sort of split your brain and write both essays at once, right? Sort of the experience of people with split brain. There's sort of a failure of communication between the two. So suppose that's possible, right? So I split my brain, I write the two essays separately, and then I join them back together again, right? So while they were split, would you say that one of those hemispheres was not you, right? Or were they both you? And if they're both you, then it's not really in principle any different than, right, the two just being in different bodies, right? So maybe it's not so absurd to say both halves are you, right? And really the absurdity comes in, right, because we think we're talking about an identity relation. And as Locke said, right, identity seems to imply that um, it can't exist in two places at once. Right? So, like, for example, right, maybe the moment you divide, it makes sense to say, I guess they're both you, right? Sort of like as if they were, it's not so different than if they're both in the same head. But suppose we divide, right, the brains into two bodies and then let them go live separate lives, right? 10 years later, they have different jobs, they went to different schools, they have kids, different memories, right? Different goals. Um, then are they both you? Are they both the same person? Then it starts to again feel like, no, probably not, right? So it seems like, which is right, right? We have the intuition. At first we said, well, if you split me, they can't both be me. But then you have the split brain one, and you think, well, maybe they are both me. Then you split them and let them go for a while, and then it seems really hard to say they're both the same person. Right? So maybe the problem is this word identity, right? Um, maybe there's maybe the relevant concept isn't identity here. Maybe it's something nearby, something different. So take the concept of survival, right? So we could rephrase a lot of these questions about personal identity, right? Am I the same person as I was when I was a baby? You could also say, like, did that baby survive to the present day? In some ways, it seems like synonymous, or you could substitute it, right? Um, so let's ask about this division experiment using the concept of survival and see what sorts of answers we get. Would you say that the division experiment is death, right? When you split my brain into two bodies. Um, Again, like if I can live with, if we know I can live with one half of a brain, if I took the other half and threw it away, that I didn't die. So it would seem wild to say I did die if you just took that half and instead of throwing it away, put it in another body, right? Um, so it seems like there's at least one of the halves survived, but if the one half survived, right, then you'd have to say the other half survived too, right? So um, maybe both survived. And when we're talking about survival, that doesn't seem at all. Identity, it feels contradictory, right? Because it's sort of one-to-one proposition. You can't have two things identical to each other, but I can have two things survive, right? There's no inherent logical contradiction in that, right? Parfit wants to sort of hint here that he thinks the reason, right, the split brain experiment doesn't sound so crazy, right? If you're using the notion of survival, he thinks it's because survival is a matter of degree and it's not this binary, right, concept like identity, where either you're identical or you're not. Maybe you can be more or less, maybe survive to a greater or lesser degree. We're going to come back to this notion of like the fuzzy boundary instead of the binary yes or no. Okay, here's the other thought experiment, fusion, right? So this was one of my professors at Cal State LA. That's where I sort of originally put together these slides, and I've sort of constantly just sort of like updated them as I teach this over and over. So he was my original example, and I kept the photos because it's kind of funny. Okay, so suppose the two of us fuse into one person and call that person phonate, right? Okay, so here's phonate, right? Fused. Um, so what would that be like, right? If two people fuse together, particularly, I mean, we can guess, wait, maybe they sort of look like that picture where they have sort of like a medium skin tone between the two of us and maybe my nose and his ears or something. I don't know, right? His curly hair, whatever. We somehow fuse, right? Either we average our attributes or we get some of each. Um, but mentally, what does that look like, right? Well, there's different ways you could do it, but here's one way it could work logically. Um, the new fused person could have both people's sets of memories, right? So um, I grew up in Texas. He grew up in Foad grew up in London. Maybe Nate has both sets of memories. Has memories of growing up in London, and memories of growing up in Texas. Um, maybe they have. If one had intentions, like I liked Cokes, right? I liked tamarind sodas. Maybe Nate, the fused person, likes both, right? Sure. And even has intentions to drink both, right? Um, maybe some of those memories or intention, desires, or whatever might turn out to be incompatible. Um, but that also doesn't necessarily entail some sort of contradiction that makes the whole thing incoherent, right? Maybe they'll cancel each other out, or maybe the stronger one wins, right? Right? If Foad is just so passionate about tamarind soda, and I'm kind of like, I like Coke, but I can take it or leave it, then maybe we, Fonate drinks a Coke, right? I'm sorry, Fonate drinks a tamarind soda. So again, like obviously, sort of physically not possible, but Parfit's just trying to say logically, it's not sort of obviously incoherent to consider, right, two people fusing into one and their sort of psychologies fusing. So the new person will have some new memories, some new intentions, maybe some old ones change. So again, we're using the concept of survival, right? Um, Positing that maybe this is a more appropriate notion instead of personal identity, right? Maybe we're talking about personal survival. Maybe that's what we really are concerned with this whole time, right? Um, so if I fuse with another person, have I died, right? And Parfit wants to say no, right? And you'd have to be a total egomaniac to think that any change in your intentions, right, or your desires or your memories would would be equivalent to death, right? Um, he thinks it's something like getting married or having a best friend, right? Like when you have another person that you're close to, yeah, you have to sort of compromise, right? You now their sets of intentions are very relevant to you, and you have to, right, take account of them. So it doesn't seem like it's death, right? It's a kind of survival, but maybe it's a survival of sort of a matter of degree. So, right, the previous Nate survives, but maybe to a slightly lesser degree than he was before. It's sort of a diluted Nate or something, right? Um, if and you could see different versions of it, right? Like we're like three-quarters of the one personality and one quarter of the other. So like if none or maybe almost none of Nate's memories and intentions got transferred into the used phonate, then maybe you would say that Nate died, right, in the process. So again, it's sort of a matter of degree. How much have you carried over? How much of your psychology? Um, it doesn't have to be a strict yes or no. Okay, so our third thought experiment. So we're pushing this division thing even further, right? We're imagining now repeated division, right? So again, setting the fusion aside for a moment, back to the division, right? And we said, well, when you're thinking about identity, there seems like there's no good answers. Like which one's me when I split, one, both, or neither. But if we're talking about survival, yeah, then maybe both are me, right? I survive in both bodies. And he's saying, okay, let's suppose you keep dividing. He says it helps to make sense of this scenario to introduce sort of a new concept, right? A new term. He's calling it psychological connectedness. Right? So psychological connectedness is sort of like direct and not transitive. What that means is so, suppose I divide once, right? And now there's two Nates. I'm psychologically connected to both of those, right? Because they're sort of like one generation away from me, right? But then if they divide again, I'm no longer directly connected to them. It's not transitive in that way, right? So I can be Nate A can be connected to Nate B and C, right? But Nate A is not necessarily connected to Nate's D, E, F, and G. Um, Compare that with psychological continuity, which was right Locke's notion, um, which just requires sort of overlapping right episodes of consciousness and is totally transitive. Right, if we have the chain of memories from me now back to me when I was 10, then I am psychologically continuous with myself at 10. Right, it doesn't that in principle, right, if my memory was good enough, that chain could go very, very far, right? And it would all be transitive, right, over many, many links. Psychological connectedness has to be much closer. It's not transitive over a bunch of links. Um, so again, just a little primer on transitivity relations, right? So transitive relations are the kind where if A is related to B and B is related to C, then A is also related to C, right? So some relations are transitive, some aren't. Taller than is transitive, right? So if I am taller than my wife and my wife is taller than our child, then you can conclude that I am taller than our child, right? Um, other relations are not transitive, so friend of is not transitive, right? So if I am friends with Blake and Blake is friends with Toby Maguire, uh, that doesn't mean that I'm friends with Toby Maguire, right? Okay, so that's what transitivity is. Again, if you know, often in mathematics and other things, right? Okay, so we can say um, Nate then is psychologically connected, right? And now again, psychologically connected. I know they sound similar, so it's hard to keep them psychologically continuous. That's the old Locke notion. Psychologically connected. This is the new Parfit. Nate 1 is psychologically connected to Nate 2, but not to Nate 3, right? So the transitivity fails if Nate 3 can remember most of Nate 2's life, right? And Nate 2 can remember most of Nate 1's life, but Nate 3 can't remember any of Nate 1's life, right? Um, right. So again, there's Nate 1, he divides, you've got a Nate 2 here, he divides again, you've got a Nate 3. And maybe 1 and 2 are connected because 2 can remember 1, and maybe 3 can remember 2. But if 3 can't remember all the way back to number 1, they're not psychologically connected. But they would be psychologically continuous. You'll be you'll be psychologically continuous with all of them, right, up through Nate 30. Okay, again, so just hammering this home, right? So you're going to be psychologically connected only to the close selves, right? The nearby divisions, right? Whoever can kind of remember back to you, but you're psychologically continuous with all of them, right? As long as they're sort of overlapping. So all of these people, right? All of these selves are versions of you to one degree or another, right? Um, but some to a very dim degree. So to sort of keep track of these different kinds of relations, right? Again, these matters of degree, Parfit comes up with some new terms. So he talks about an ancestral self and a descendant self. So this will be relevant to selves with which you are psychologically continuous, right? So um, if I'm Nate 30, Nate 1 will be an ancestral self. I don't remember anything from Nate 1's life, right? But I am still psychologically continuous with him, so he'll be an ancestral self, right? And if I'm Nate 30 and there's a Nate 50 out there, right? He'll be a descendant self of mine, but again, he's not going to remember anything from Nate 30's life, so psychologically continuous, but not psychologically connected. For the psychologically connected selves, it would make more sense to talk about a future self and a past self, and whether or not, right, the future or past self is going to be a matter of degree, right? So again, I'm Nate 30. Nate 31, definitely a future self. Nate 32, yeah, probably. Nate 35, maybe less so, right? Nate 35 is probably not going to remember so much of Nate 30, if any, right? Um, and so on, right? So there's not like a strict yes or no answer to whether you're a future or past self, just to a matter of degree. So it might make sense, right, in this scenario, again, where you're dividing over and over and over to say, talk about stuff like, oh yeah, that's my most recent self, or that's barely a past self, right? It's so far back that it's like just barely. And you might even say that's not even a past self at all. That's just an ancestral self, right? There's sort of a, yeah, I'm continuous with it, but I'm not psychologically. Okay, with all that machinery, right, and that central notion of the distinction between connectedness and continuity, um, now we'll introduce another thought experiment, which is combines the first two, fusion and division, right? and they both happen over and over and over. So you get this sort of honeycomb thing, right? So he's saying, imagine that people fuse every autumn and then divide again every spring, right? Now, to be clear, because the people who have had this misconception before, it's not the same two people just fusing and dividing, right? You fuse and then you divide and then you fuse again with somebody else, right? And then right, you're tracing out this honeycomb. So um, it gets very confusing, right? Who you're related to. I mean, ultimately, you'd be related, everyone in this web is related to everyone else, right? So this ancestral and descendant self, not not particularly useful because basically everyone is an ancestral or descendant. Um, and the term I is not particularly useful either because a single self only lasts for 6 months, right, before you divide or fuse again. Um, so most of their planning for the future and most of their right memories that they talk about are going to be about future and past selves, right? So even the notion of being a self is going to be mostly a matter of degree for them, right? There's not going to be any strong sense where personal identity over time is like a useful concept at all, right? They're really only going to have to use psychological connectedness as the relevant concept. And final thought experiment. Um, Suppose there's creatures, right? And they're not fusing and dividing and all that stuff. They just have everlasting bodies. They're immortal, right? Um, so even in this situation, right, without any sort of like dividing or any of that nonsense, just lasting forever, um, you're going to change so much, right? Right now, you probably can't remember anything from when you were 2, right? You might remember a few key things from when you were 5, right? Already you're not super psychologically connected, right, to your 5-year-old self. So imagine if you live 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, right, 10 million years. Um, yeah, you're not going to be psychologically connected to like most of your right previous self. Um, in a single life, psychological connectedness is going to vary a lot, right? So again, the whole life is going to be psychologically continuous, right? The whole sort of infinite line. Um, but the whole thing's not going to be psychologically connected, right? You have these little sort of overlapping um, bits that'll be psychologically connected, but certainly the whole line will not be psychologically connected. It may not really make sense to call the whole thing the same life, right? If one of these people said to you, "Oh yeah, I fought in the Civil War," um, what do they mean by I there? They're not saying they remember any of it. They probably don't have any of the same personality traits anymore, right? It's been hundreds of years. People fought just in like 10 years, right? Can you imagine how different your personality would be in 200 years? Um, they're not like currently carrying out any of the plans that they had made back in the whatever 1800s. Um, so is it I fought in the Civil War? It's like an earlier self that did that, right? So again, selves for these everlasting bodies would be defined by degrees of psychological connectedness, and maybe I is relevant for like the highest degree of psychological connectedness, right? So where I'm like pretty much really in touch with all the most recent sort of conscious events, and I'm planning for the next coming ones. Yeah, then we'll talk about I did this and I'm going to do that, right? But as it gets further away, using I, right, to refer to those future and past selves, maybe not so accurate. Um, okay, so right, Parfit's point here is right again to explore all these concepts and to point out that when we push these a lot, right, and imagine other ways that we might have a self sort of existing over time, and ways we might have to relate to ourselves from the past and the future. Um, Seems like identity goes out the window real quick, right? Identity, it seems like too strict, too mathematical of a relation to really capture what we're concerned with here. And maybe survival helps, but he seems to really focus in on psychological connectedness as really the relevant thing that we care about here. So it's still a psychological criterion, right? It's not about your body. He doesn't think that what makes you over time is necessarily your body. He thinks it's something to do with your psychology, but he doesn't think it's continuity. He doesn't think it's this transitive relation, right? He thinks it's more a more direct relation, um, and it's a notion of connectedness. It's a matter of degree, right? And it's not a yes or no. Am I identical with my previous self or not? Okay, so he has a few final thoughts, a few takeaways from this approach, right? Which are kind of interesting. Um, so he borrows this quote from Proust, um, who's a writer, right? Wrote Remembrance of Things. He says, "We are incapable, while we are in love, of acting as fit predecessors of the next persons who, when we are in love no longer, we shall presently become." Right. So, what does that mean there? He's saying, if any of you have ever been in love, right, and then fallen out of love, um, it's a strange experience to look back on it, right? Because when you're in love, this person is so important to you. You think about them all the time. It's hard to imagine living without them, right? They sort of start to govern, you sort of like maybe flake on some of your schoolwork so you can be with them and stuff, right? Um, and then a year later or so, and you're no longer in love with them, and you can look back and be like, why did I even care about that person? It's hard for me to imagine even being that wrapped up in them, right? I barely ever think about them. So that's what Proust is saying there, right? That even within like a year, right, yourself can change so dramatically, right? Um, Sometimes it does feel like our future selves or our past selves are like really different from each other, right? Um, And so, we don't have everlasting bodies, but we do live a long time, right? And if we can change that dramatically just within a year, as far as our, romantic relationships, maybe there's not so much of a difference between us and the everlasting bodies. Maybe it's just, a little bit, obviously they're longer, right? But in principle, the same sort of thing. So if this is starting to make sense, and you can think of yourself as like, okay, yeah, I it makes sense that I don't really identify so much with myself as a 5-year-old, right? I'm continuous maybe with that person, but I don't feel really connected to them. Um, if that starts to, if you can kind of relate to that, then one interesting thing is that why are we worried about dying in like whatever 60 years for you folks, right? Um, According to this account, you're not going to be the same person. Right? You might be psychologically continuous with that person, but you have very little in common with the person that's going to be in the hospital bed in 60 years, right? So, yeah, don't worry about dying. It's not going to be you, right? All right, well, that is it for this lecture. We're on Parfit, and we will pick up with Hume next.